Hello, I'm Rose Solari, and I'm back in the Alan Squire Publishing Reading Room with another installment of these weekly live Facebook live streams. If you were with me last week, you know that we had a few technical difficulties, but I can tell you that even if the screen freezes or does something strange while we're here together, it will post correctly later. So if you get discouraged, you can always see it later. But I'm going to keep moving and keep going live regardless. So, as I said, I'm Rose Solari, poet, fiction writer, teacher, co founder of Alan Squire Publishing, a small press with big ideas. While we're all quarantining, we're doing a number of weekly videos with various authors. My husband, Jimmy Patterson, is going Facebook Live every Monday at 4 in this same room from a different angle. I'm here every Wednesday at 4, that's Eastern Standard Time, and we've got various other things coming along the way. I also want to remind you that in order to help you get through this quarantine time with good books, we've cut all our ebooks to either 99 cents or $1.99. And all of the hard copy, beautiful books that we make are on sale on our website, AlanSquirePublishing.com. They're in various packages and bundles and 2-for-1 deals, and I will wipe them all down personally with Clorox wipes. We have plenty. So get your reading on, folks. It's National Poetry Month, and so for all this month, I'm featuring poetry. Last week, I read poems by two incredible women poets, Grace Cavalieri and Linda Watanabe McFerrin. Today, I'm paying tribute to my MFA professor, mentor, the great late American poet Stanley Plumly. Saturday marked the first anniversary of Stan's death on April 11th, 2019, and it is still deeply painful to those of us who knew and loved that man to think that the world doesn't have him in it anymore. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about my own relationship to Stan, how I came to study with him, and then read some of my favorite poems of his. I took a rather circuitous route, I would say, through my undergraduate career for reasons we don't really need to get into at this point. I moved out of my parents' house when I turned 18. I had very little financial support. I was working to support myself, multiple part time jobs while working my way through community college and then the University of Maryland. Maryland had a fantastic literary department in the 80s, and the English program there featured such amazing teachers as John O'Shard, Michael Collier, Rod Jellema, Neil Freistadt, Verlin Flieger, Donna Hamilton, Teresa Coletti, an astonishing group of wonderful professors who I was really lucky to study with. But by the time I got through, it had taken nearly 6 years, and I was tired. And though my devotion to poetry was complete, I wasn't sure that I necessarily needed to get an MFA or to pursue graduate work in order to become a better poet. I knew academic jobs were limited, and I wasn't entirely, I also didn't want to establish any debt. I got into the MA program at NYU when I was 25, 26, with a very limited financial aid package, but I just couldn't get the finances together to go. That was heartbreaking. I would have studied with Galway Connell, which would have been pretty wonderful. But I didn't want to take out a loan, which now, in retrospect, I'm really happy about. So I concocted a little plan of my own, and this will come up later as well, that I was going to, because I loved working in restaurants, I was a good waitress, good bartender. I concocted this little plan where I would buy a small house on the beach, turn the first floor into a little bar, club kind of thing, live upstairs, and write my poems. So I started a management training course in restaurants to learn what I needed to know. Well, I'm sure that everyone out there who's actually run a restaurant is laughing now because you know that that is not a career that allows for another career. So I was a bit lost, a bit confused, sad about the lost NYU opportunity. Still reading and working on my poems. I was getting published. I won some awards, but I just felt stuck. I didn't feel as though I was getting anywhere. And I wasn't sure how to become a better poet without some kind of mentorship and guidance, but where to get it and from who. So One night I got off a long shift and I was tired and exhausted and probably had too much wine and I was a little sad. I was a very sad person in my 20s, interestingly enough. I'm oddly lighter hearted now than I was when I was younger and had so many more opportunities ahead of me. So I'm not really sure why that was, but I was a pretty sad 20 something. I always had a subscription to the New Yorker. My father always made sure I had that, even if I didn't have enough food. Um, and one night I opened it up and read this poem by a poet I had never heard of before, whose name was Stanley Plumly. It's called The Missionary Position. And I'm going to read it to you and then tell you a little bit about what it was that made me fall for this poem and this poet's work so deeply. This is called The Missionary Position, and it's by Stanley Plumly from his book, Summer Celestial. Even the light coming down is slick with rain, and the wind with its small cups filled. I have opened my eyes in the dark in a dream of people trying to pass from one high place to the next. Each roof slopes sharp with tiles. I cannot catch them, no one. They slip from me like parts of myself, like parts of another body. If I watch face within face, if I look down as at a wound, I know I will not wake whole. As it is, I have opened my eyes in the dark without parents, unable to open my hands. But I can hear the oak outside make its own green passage. I can see light just under the window, under the shadow of glass on the wall. This is not what I wanted. I was in love. I was one blind body moving over another. I am going to lie here until I fall back to sleep. I am going to close my eyes and think my way back. I am going to let the rain come down all over me. There's so much to admire in this poem. I was up all night that night rereading it, working on something of my own, but it was really, most of all for me, the astonishing music in Stan's work that grabbed me right away. My father was a great reciter of poems from memory, and he loved Keats and Shakespeare. And it was interesting to me later when I came to study with Stan to discover that he also loved Keats, because I think there was something in the sounds, in the assonance, the rhymes of the vowels, the long O's, in the consonants, the rhymes of the consonants, the M's, the N's, the L's. There was something in all that that sang to me just right away. There's also that gorgeous turn that the poem takes. We often talk about a turn in a poem. Sometimes it happens in the very last stanza. Sometimes it happens in the penultimate stanza. Sometimes in this, a 2-stanza poem, it happens in the middle of the second stanza. With that repetition beginning with, I am going to lie here until I fall back to sleep. A very simple, rather prosaic idea. I'm going to try to overcome my insomnia. I'm going to go back to my dream. Then I am going to close my eyes and think my way back. To what? To when? To when you were that body in love? And then finally, I am going to let the rain come down all over me. And now we're in almost pure metaphor land. And we feel that rain. And we feel that gentleness. And we hear the music of it. So I fell in love with this poem. And I started looking for other Stanley Plumly poems. And the more I found to love. And so I decided that I would study with him, that I would find out where he was teaching, and I'd go work with him. He was teaching at the time in Houston, a city I knew nothing about. I don't think I'd ever been to Texas at that point. But I called Rod Jellema, my undergraduate poetry mentor. He and Michael Collier were my great undergrad teachers in poetry. And I said, I'm going to go study with Stanley Plumly. I need you to help me. I need you to write me a recommendation letter. I need to figure this out. And Rod said, shh, don't tell anyone. But I think we're going to get him to come to Maryland. Just wait a year. It's not easy for me to be patient. I don't like to wait, but it sounded like a good piece of advice. Stan came to visit Maryland and gave a reading that knocked me out. Everything he read was stunning. Everything he said was brilliant and insightful. And indeed, very soon, he came to Maryland. I applied to the program. I got in. And thanks to a little helpful advice from the great Teresa Coletti, I got a full fellowship, which meant that I actually got paid to get my degree. Not a lot. I was still living in a crappy basement apartment, but I was studying with the poet whose work I admired most, and he was magnificent. The first poem I turned into his class, he loved, and I felt a little cocky and was hoping to get a similar reaction to my second poem. Suffice to say that did not happen. It was a 35-line poem that I still remember Stan saying had about 5 good lines. Ouch. But he was right. At the time, my biggest influence was Robert Duncan, a very mystical poet with a great love of the esoteric and arcane, and Anne Sexton, a confessional poet of great lyricism, but also great emotional honesty, which I loved, and I was trying to work with that. In this particular poem, I was quite proud of myself because those 5 lines that Stan pointed out were a rather graphic description of oral sex, and I thought, hey, it was the 80s. I thought I was being sassy and provocative and very Anne Sexton-like. But the rest of the poem was pretty crappy, largely because it was full of self-pity. And Stan said something to me then that I've always carried with me, which is, you must resist the temptation to be the hero of your own poem. One of the things I've often found stunning about his work is the way he can almost disappear in his poems. The self dissolves into the natural world, into perceptions and meditations on what is that are personal and yet not. They open to us so that we are allowed in. And often the vehicle for that openness in his work is his appreciation of nature and his deep knowledge of nature. Another poem of Stan's that I deeply love is called The Marriage in the Trees. And I think this poem really demonstrates what I'm talking about. And after I read this one to you, I'm going to share one of my own that I wrote under the influence of Stan. But this to me is an astonishing poem about the ways in which the natural world can echo, mirror, illuminate what's going right and wrong in our own lives. And in this case, it's the natural world mirroring back the dissolution of a marriage. This is called The Marriage in the Trees. When the wind was right, everything else was wrong. Like the oak we thought built better than the house, split like a ship on rock. We let it stand the winter, spectral, shagged, every sky its snow, then cut it down in pieces like disease. Then limbs from the yellow poplar broke at will, fell from the heights like bones of the Puritans. Even to gather them in bundles seemed puritanical. And the willow, by its nature, wept long tears of its overbranching, so pale they were autumnal. These we turned too easily to switches, mocking the bickering in the spruce's nesting eaves, which crows, then jays, bothered all they could. The list. The sycamore made maps of disappearance. The copper beech, parental in its girth, was clipped hard by a car with a wound that wouldn't heal. Doctoring, then witchery, then love. Nothing we tried would work. More apple trees that grew nowhere but down. More maples spilling sugar. more hawthorns blazing out, telling truth. I found that poem absolutely astonishing as a person who is now divorced twice, and it's always wrenching, never easy. I found in this poem such a beautiful way of discussing that pain without self-pity, without focusing on blaming or the particulars or whatever one might be distracted by when facing a great grief. And it was through watching Stan do such things and learning these things that I came to write some of the poems that appeared in my first book, Difficult Weather. Originally, most of these poems were in my thesis that I worked on under him, but I added new ones throughout old ones. Many things happened in the 4 years between when I graduated with my MFA and my first book appeared. Another thing Stan taught me, and this is important for the poem I'm about to read to you, which is the title poem of my first book, Difficult Weather. Another thing he taught me was to leave room for mystery. Often, perhaps out of a sense of insecurity or a sense of something to prove, I would feel as though my poems had to really resolve themselves. They had to bring a strong and striking conclusion that would help the reader understand something significant, that would illuminate something. Stan helped me to trust a process that was more open, less rigid, a process that allowed for uncertainty, that did not so easily resolve. And I was reminded of this again last year when I heard the wonderful poet Ilya Kaminsky speak in Washington, D.C., and he talked about this very issue of resolution and said, sometimes you have to remember that resolution is the point at which you actually stop asking questions. And isn't part of the poet's job to continue to ask questions? Beautiful idea, which made me remember some of Stan's advice about mystery and allowing that mystery to play itself through without itching to fix it or see too clearly too fast. So here's the title poem of my first book, Difficult Weather. It was reissued a couple years ago. It's set on Sugarloaf Mountain, a place I love to hike in the Maryland countryside. It's somewhat of a cliche at this point to say that poets don't always know what their poems are about until they write them, but it's actually also true. And I did not know what this poem was about until I wrote it. I thought it was about wanting to be part of the mountain, but it was also, I see now, a kind of precognizance of my father's death and what that would do. Difficult weather. I've been here so many times. The slow revolving ascent up the mountain's axis, tracing the curving stones. Coming back like coming back to a body I've loved, to feel the familiar skin turn warm and shift beneath me. If I walk hard enough and stop short, everywhere the mountain is rolling. And today, because it has rained for so many days, because now the water no longer falls but hangs in the air, I see how the elements are confused. The earth more water than anything, the air stopped with dirt. It spreads itself over my face like makeup, gray and glittering, and comes off on my hands. At the West Overlook, I stop for a while, reconsider the route I'll take. A kind of silence made by 100 small sounds at once, like the mountain's breath drawn in, drawn out. If I came here to think about you, it must be because there is nothing here that reminds me of your face. If I were to lie down right now, the mountain would take me in. I don't think it would hurt. The roots lacing up through my ribs, the ground folding over my skin. not to visit this place, but instead to be given over into its own deliberate progression. The slope to the river on one side, the green digression of hills that I can't see today, but remember. You wanted to teach me to love the confusion of heart and circumstance, figure and ground. But in my dreams, you are always turning or about to turn into a mist like the one coming down now over this mountain. And if I put my hand out, I disappear up to the wrist, up to the elbow, into this air that is really water, this water between us. I want to reason you back into form, into my hands, but there's not enough light. Looking back at this poem now, I see how certain lines, like the green digression of hills, are so influenced by Stan's music and also his insights into the natural world. It was a hard poem for me to write. As I said, I didn't really realize where it was headed. And then, shortly after it was completed, my father entered his final illness, and I realized it was a farewell to him. Stan's farewell poems are always stunning. He is a great poet of elegy and of the things that we lose and cling to and remember. He's a great poet of the dead. He holds his dead close and remembers them cleanly and without sentiment, but with great power. And I'm very fond of a poem of his called Wisman's Wood that addresses some of these things. It's going to take me a second to find it. I thought I had it picked out, and I was wrong. So, as I go about this, I will also say that he led absolutely the best classroom discussions I've ever been a part of. I've never been in a workshop quite like Stan's, and in fact, I think you could say that he might ruin you for any other workshop. For one thing, he talked about the poems on the page very clearly and in immense detail, but they were also really only the jumping off point for a wider range discussion of American poetry, European poetry, the lyric, the narrative, the sonnet form, romanticism, modernism. I would walk out of those classes with my head just spinning with information and so ready to write, which of course is what you want from an MFA program, right? I also discovered that in addition to his great love of Keats, my childhood poet, Stan also had a great love of England, as do I. And this, I think, is an extraordinarily beautiful depiction of a walk in England. This is from his book, Orphan Hours. I should add, by the way, that there's a posthumous book coming out, The Middle Distance, which the wonderful poet David Baker has edited. He and Stan were dear friends, and I cannot wait to see that book, which comes out this year. This is from Orphan Hours. It's called Wisman's Wood. More like a witch's wood, a patch of acreage halfway up the hill above West Dart. A moorland stream you can almost step across, but clean, fast, as if it were descending off a mountain. The wood, too, descending as if sliding, though that aspect of its attitude is wind blowing like a river, west to east, so constant in its quest, it blows away the birds and cuts in half the trees. Stunted primal oaks, deities, enchantresses, anomalies of spirits underground, or are they these isolated, ancient, broken beings like me, bent in the middle of their souls? Because it matters, imagine Wisman's Wood for what it is. Centuries, perpetual, growing out of stones at human height, limestone big as boulders, all of it locked up in Devon mist and barnacled with lichen. We were there in winter. We were warned. The path between the bogs and floating marsh was far too small to tolerate mistakes, and the sign said so. It took an hour or more, walking single file from where we left the car at the crossroads at Two Bridges. Were we happy? Were we ever going to die? I should have held your hand and then held on. It's hard to do any poet justice in a half an hour, talking about many things. And it's hard, especially at this time, to talk about Stan. It's National Poetry Month. We're in a crisis in our country, in the world. We're not meeting to share our poems because we can't. We're doing them this way, which is not ideal, but what we have. I don't think I've even begun to scrape the surface of what he meant to me or to the many poets he mentored and taught. There was a memorial service for him at the University of Maryland last fall where many great writers and wonderful human beings, including my co-student in that first U of Maryland MFA graduating class, David Beispiel, spoke about Stan. It's interesting to me, too, that many of us have a rather entrepreneurial spirit in our own poetry world. David started the Atticus Institute. I co-founded Alan Squire Publishing. And I'm reviewing poetry now again for the Washington Independent Review of Books, in part due to a conversation I had with Stan shortly before he died, where he was lamenting the dearth of good poetry reviewing. He could give you a nudge in the slightest way that would bear fruit later, and I'm still feeling those nudges, and I'm still carrying his immense wisdom in my heart. So I'm going to conclude with a beautiful poem, one that alerted, I think, the larger world to the fact that we were going to lose Stan. This is a poem that I believe appeared originally in the New Yorker. It's also in the book Orphan Hours, and it's called Cancer. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for tuning in and sharing your love of Stan's work. I can see some beautiful comments coming up from other former students of his. I'll see you back here next Wednesday for another installment of our National Poetry Month readings. You can find these videos archived on Facebook and on the Alan Squire Publishing site. That's alansquirepublishing.com. This is called Cancer. Mine, I know, started at a distance, 520 light years away, and fell as stardust into my sleeping mouth. Yesterday, at birth, or that time when I was 10, lying on my back, looking up at the cluster called the beehive, or by its other name in the constellation Cancer, the crab, able to move its nebula projections backward and forward, side to side, in the tumor Hippocrates describes as carcinoma, from Carcinos, the analog, in order to show what being cancer looks like. Star, therefore, to start, like waking on the best day of your life, to feel this living and immortal thing inside you. You were in love, you were a saint, you were going to walk the sunlight, blessing water. You were almost word for word forever. The crown, the throne, the thorn. Now to see the smoke shining in the mirror, the long half dark of dark down the hallway inside it. Now to see what wasn't there before. The old loved landscape fading from the window, the druid soul within the dying tree, the depth of blue coloring the cornflower, the birthday ribbon river of the road, and the young man who resembles you, opening a door in the half-built house you helped your father build, saying in your voice, come forth. Thanks for joining me for this tribute to the great Stanley Plumly. I'm Rose Solari of Allen Squire Publishing, a small press with big ideas. I got a lot of my big ideas from that great man, and I hope that I've been able to share some of his greatness with you today. Stan, you'll always be missed, and every time I drink a good red wine, especially one from Italy, I think of you. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.